All right, well, we're out in the shop today and we are back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. We are very, very close with this thing. I mean, we are on the home stretches of home stretches. So last episode, we got this thing fired up for the first time. We had a couple little issues to sort out, but once those were done, it clicked right off. It revs smooth, it revs clean, all of that is good and well. The fuel system doesn't have any leaks. The oil system doesn't have any leaks. The last thing to test is the cooling system. So we need to get water in it, we need to prime the system, and we need to run it up to operating temperature and make sure that everything's gonna work as it should and we aren't gonna have any leaks there. And we need to make it a driver, right? So it's a running car now, but we can't drive it because we have no brakes and no clutch hydraulics. So we need to get all our brake lines in, our clutch lines in, our brake calipers on, get all those systems bled, and we'll have a running driving vehicle. So pretty exciting stuff. I am real ready to get into it. So I've got a box of lines, get those opened up and start tossing them in the car. All right, so what we have here is literally every single brake line for this car and clutch line. Well, there's two clutch lines that we had to install when we put the trans in. But other than that, this is everything. Oh, sweetie, label them, dude. I can't say enough good things about this company. Look at this, look at this. Would you just look at this? Wow, that is impressive. There's a lot of lines. Oh man, this thing's so long it doesn't even fit on the table. Look at this. That is a lot of lines, man, a lot of lines. But that is every line for this car, as I said. So this is from a company called Finishing Lines. So I was really amped to find them and be able to use them because it saved me a metric ton of time in this process of doing brake lines for this car. So they do all sorts of stuff, right? They do like ABS delete kits, they do tucked brake line kits, all of that. That's actually how I found out about them. My buddy Derek used their ABS delete kit on a C5 and he had posted a video. He was really impressed with the quality and the packaging, and I was like, oh dang, and I reached out to them to see if they could do a custom set of lines, and no problem at all. Piece of cake, just another day in the office for them. So they got these things whipped up super fast. I was looking at really long lead times just buying off the shelf pre-made lines, and I was worried we weren't going to be able to get it done. You know, we weren't going to be able to get enough stuff to brake line this whole car, but they came through, they saved the day. Without them, we'd probably be a lot further behind right now and we wouldn't have a whole set of brake lines ready to go in the car. So the cool thing about these is they have a Teflon core, so they won't break down over time like a rubber line and they don't swell like a rubber line. So you get that consistent pedal feel that you would want out of, you know, say a hard line, but while having the ability to have a soft line, which to me is a much simpler way to do it, not having to worry about bending and routing hard lines and having issues with that. And if you need to replace it, it's just boom, hey, I need another line this length with these fittings on it. No problem at all. All right, well, first up was installing the reservoir lines, but we made a little bit of an error here. I made an error. So Josue measured them as going in with straight fittings. And then when I was talking to the guys over at Finishing Lines, they're like, oh, would you rather do banjos to keep it lower profile? I was like, yeah, that'd be perfect. But I didn't think about the fact that the routing to use a banjo would require us making the lines a little bit longer. So like we can make them work, but instead we're gonna have them remade a little bit longer and then they'll tuck nice and be consistent, and you know the deal. So that also brought up an idea to use banjo adapters here to our straight fittings instead of just the straight fittings, because that'll also keep things tucked a little bit lower. So the benefit here is all of our stuff's going to be tucked lower than we thought. I'd like to make this false floor as low as possible, but the downside is we've got to wait on those lines and the adapters to AN straight for here. But that won't stop us from at least putting all the lines in the car. So we went ahead and started routing the rest of the lines through the car. Fortunately, this kit made it really easy, and using all soft lines made it an absolute piece of cake to put these lines in. We wanted to get the rest in because, one, they're going to be in and they're going to be essentially done. Now, we can't tidy it up, but at least they're there and we've got minimal work once we get the last few parts and pieces we need. but two, just again, to make sure that everything fits as it should, our measurements were correct, and everything's gonna work like we want. Now is the time to find out if it's not. All right, we've got all the brake lines in, so pretty happy with how all of this turned out. So up here, you've got our clutch lines. So we've got bulkheads. On the other side, we have dry brakes, so we can pull the bell housing without dripping or leaking any fluid. That's a huge thing. One of those things I've always wanted to do that. So we have our clutch line and our bleeder line. And the reason our bleeder line comes all the way up here is so that it can be a one-man operation to bleed it. So it's long enough to where we can literally just dunk it back in the reservoir, bleed it to itself, and be done, and you can do it by yourself. You don't need one person under the car, you know, opening and closing the bleeder, and one person up here pumping. So I've done it on pretty much every car with an internal throwout bearing that I've had, and it is life-changing. If you're ever doing a setup like that, just get a long line and run it back to the reservoir, works mint. So we have that. We have our brake lines and our clutch line. You can see how nice the banjos are back here. It just looks way nicer. It keeps everything way lower profile, just like the front. So really happy with those titanium banjo bolts too. Those look really cool. So yeah, these things look really good, man. So another thing back here, we got our lines to our dry brakes. So oversight on my part, I ordered some aluminum tees. You don't really want to use aluminum on brake fittings because of how high pressure it is. So we ordered some steel tees. One of those things, like we gotta wait for them, but you know, it works out. So yeah, we tested our lines from the dry brakes to the calipers. They all gonna work out well. We went with the same length lines, front and rear. So we got also a spare set of lines, and that way those two spare lines will work on the front or the rear. So pretty happy with that all worked out well. So overall, it's all gonna work out good. We just need a couple little odd and end fittings that we didn't think about, like changing those T's and converting that to banjo and yada, yada, yada. So what we're gonna do is move on to another big thing of the car, and that is putting coolant in it. So we're gonna figure out if we have any leaks. These are the longest lines in the car. They took a while to make, so let's put some water in this thing. It's a little bit of a nerve-wracking moment, but you know, we gotta find out now. I feel like every time I put coolant in something, there's always at least one leak. Maybe this time we'll get lucky. Ready? So I thought this was going to be the easiest coolant prime of my life. We've got a very high point right above the radiator with big lines and fittings, should flow a ton of water into the radiator quickly, get the air out, and we've got an electric water pump, which means we don't have to run the engine to bleed this thing. This is gonna be great. Well, wasn't the case. We started trying to prime it, had the pump running, and we weren't getting anything up front. And one thing I've learned with any sort of rear-mounted fluid-carrying thing, like a radiator or an oil tank for a dry sump, is if you're not getting it bled, you're not getting water up, just unbolt it and lift it up as high as you can with the line still attached. And it hasn't failed me yet, and it worked just fine on this thing, sucked the water down, and we finally got this thing to a nice level bled with good water flow. A1. So with the cooling system bled and seemingly working, getting good flow back and forth, no leaks, we wanted to move on to the next big issue before starting this thing up, and that was some serviceability issues we had with the intake manifold. This thing has been the bane of my existence with this car as far as working on it goes. We worked so hard to make everything as easy as possible, and this thing has been a nuisance. So we're tackling those problems one thing at a time. The first one was the coil pack wires. You couldn't get to them with the intake on. You had to put them on as you put the intake on. It was absolutely silly. So we did some extensions. We're able to access those from the outside. Now, the next thing was the throttle cable. So this aftermarket throttle cable, I had this collar that would hold it together, just kept falling apart. So we glued that together because when it would fall out, then the housing would fall out and the cable would get all bound up, and it was a mess. Now, the other problem is to service the cable, to take the cable out, we have to take the end off it, and then we have to lift the intake up so we can thread that housing out of the throttle cable mount. So that has been a big issue, something that's really difficult. If you have to mess with it at all, you have to pull the intake, which is not fun. So another thing I wanted to do was rectify that issue and make this throttle cable mount serviceable with the intake on. So to do that, we slid it and then opened it up so that way we could just slide the cable housing end into it, tighten the 2 jam nuts, and be done with it. So I got the slot wide enough, I got that all sorted, and then I went ahead and flattened out both sides so that way the jam nuts would have a nice flat surface to tighten down on both sides. So that was another big thing. And then I also wanted to incorporate some sort of safety so that if the jam nuts came loose, the cable couldn't fall out. So what I did was drilled and tapped in the very bottom under where the cable housing goes. So you'll slide the cable housing up, tighten down the jam nuts, and then put a bolt in so even if it comes loose, it can't fall out. And then another issue with the whole throttle cable situation is down at the pedal box, the mount was flexing a lot, and we're trying to get every bit of travel we can out of this system. So one thing I wanted to do was go ahead and drill and tap a hole, and that way I could thread a bolt in and use it as a stop to prevent flex and even give me a little bit extra adjustment at the pedal to get everything nice and tight and snug so we got maximum throw from the pedal. All right, intake back on, fully bolted down. We now have easy access to our coil pack connectors instead of having to fish them in between the runners of the intake as you installed it. That was not fun. So that is sorted as of now. And our throttle cable situation, much improved. I was not happy with this throttle cable setup before. Again, now we have the serviceability of being able to slide it out with the intake still on without removing the intake. Before, you'd have to remove this barrel, lift the intake up, thread it out by hand, and then bring the cable out because this wouldn't fit through the hole. So now we can take the whole cable housing, anything off without pulling the intake. That's great. But also, originally, with the way it was all set up, we got, with the pedal going almost to the floorboard, you know, the stop set to where literally the pedal was almost touching back here, which would not be comfortable at all for driving. If you had to go that far for full throttle, we still were only getting like 40% blade opening at the throttle body. So it was not good. So luckily with a bunch of adjustments and changes, we're able to make it to where we now have a very reasonable pedal stroke to go from 0 to 100% throttle. So really happy with that. I put this little stop here just because this bracket was flexing a little bit, which was taking away some of our travel at the throttle body. So fix that. The only thing left really is the angle of this. No matter what, it rubs on the housing. The cable rubs on the housing. I'm afraid that's going to tear up the cable rather quickly. So this throttle cable, for as simple as it is, just a throttle cable with this pedal box, has definitely been a challenge, but we've got it workable now. We've got a 0 to 100% throttle without the pedal going 2 miles, and everything's tight and serviceable. So I'm really happy with that. It's one of those little things that just weighed on me. It bugged me. So with that done, we're about ready to fire this thing up and let it run for a little while. Before that though, I want to go ahead and get some heat shielding between the fuel cell and the exhaust. I need to hammer the exhaust in some, flatten it out so we can get a nice air barrier with our heat shield and get that sorted before we let everything run and really heat up. So yeah, we got to pull it back out, hammer it, heat shield, you know the deal. Enough jibber jabber, let's lift this thing up, get back to work. With the exhaust pulled out, I had marked where we needed to flatten it out, and one thing I've learned with this kind of process is, one, you want to heat it up. It makes it a lot easier to move some metal. Two, you always kind of want to go more than you think. You know, you have to fight that urge where you don't want to flatten it out too much or more than you need to. But it's one of those things, if you don't, then you're going to end up test fitting it a bunch of times and hammering it that much anyway. So I went to town, I flattened it out as much as I absolutely could. And in the meantime, Josue was working on getting our heat shield in. So we have this Mishimoto dimpled heat shield plate stuff. This stuff is super, super handy because it's very, very flexible and really easy to work with. And it works really well from keeping heat from one item to another. So with that in and riveted on, all we had to do was toss the exhaust back in and see if it all fit back correctly, and we had the room we were looking for, if I hammered enough, all that good stuff. All right, mission accomplished. With the exhaust back in, we now have a good amount of clearance. We've got a gap to the shield and then the gap that we built in from the shield to the cell itself. So we should be good. I'm glad that worked out. As much as it was painful to take a big old sledgehammer to this nice exhaust that I built, put a lot of time into, you got to do what you got to do. Function over form. So with that, we're pretty much ready to start it up and let it run for a little while. However, Josue is not here yet, so I'm gonna wait for him to get here. It'll just be easier to keep an eye on everything with 2 people. I normally do it by myself, and it's tough trying to check for leaks and kind of man the gauges and make sure everything's happy and you got good oil pressure and all that stuff. So I'm just gonna wait for him to get here. It'll make life a little simpler. So in the meantime, I'm gonna knock out some odds and ends. So the first odd or end, if you will, was this blower motor. So we have this blowing air into the engine bay now, and I wanted to get this fully attached. It had been just kind of dangling there, in and out. I wanted to get it clamped on, tightened up, and ready to go. So that was done and dusted. And then I wanted to move on to the power steering pump. So our connector is absolutely smoked. It's all melty. It's not going to work right. So we're going to have to improvise and build our own setup and build it to a new connector, so that way we have something that's not burnt up and potentially not transferring all the power that we need to, because this power steering has to work. This is one of the biggest question marks on the car, is whether or not this power steering will feel right, self-steer right, and do what it needs to do, because if it doesn't, the car is not going to be very good to drive. I mean, it's one thing that can absolutely ruin the functionality of a drift car. So we want to make sure we cross our T's and dot our I's with this. So what I did was I got some big 50 amp connectors. I pinned those to the wires for the chassis, and I'm going to pin them to the wires coming from the power steering pump itself. So what I wanted to do was solder these wires to the blades on the power steering pump and then pot it with potting epoxy, seal it all up, and then have that secondary connector kind of off to the side. However, my plan did not work out like I was hoping, so I had to improvise a little bit, switch to crimping the wires on after I stripped apart the factory connector and got the spades out of it, which were fortunately still in good shape at least, and then pot it with the potting epoxy compound, let it sit, and hope it works like I'm expecting it to. All right, well, I had to shift strategies a little bit on this. I'm not super happy with it, but it should work fine. Potted it, that stuff's gonna take a while. I mean, it has a 45-minute working time, so it's probably gonna be a solid 24-hour cure time. So we'll let this thing sit and set up before we start messing with it again. Josue's been working on the brake lines. Our steel tees came in so we could start finalizing these out here. So with that, we've been tidying up our little projects. Josue's still tinkering back there. We've still got to do some P-clamping, but I think it's time before we get our afternoon Florida thunderstorm to open the door, push this thing out by the door, fire it up, let it run for a little while. See if it can get to temp and then come down from temp and all of those good things. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering. We're gonna drop this thing down, get the door open, and kick the tires, light the fires, right, Josue? We gotta put some fuel in it too. Need to do that. Yeah, probably dump 2 gallons out with all our line swapping. Beautiful. So with any fresh build where you've touched your hands all over the headers and stuff, and especially with this since they were wrapped, there's a lot of smoke that comes off from the oils and the glue and all that stuff. So we decided to push this thing all the way out into the driveway. Now, we were messing with it, and I was trying to get the idle dialed in, and we started having some issues where this thing just wanted to surge. No matter how hard we tried, every time I started it up, it would surge. And looking at the idle air control valve percentages, it didn't make sense. You know, I kept lowering the throttle blade because I'm watching how much it's opening, and it seemed as if it was trying to close all the way, and it was still idling too high. And that was the issue that I felt like we were chasing. So we started messing with it. We started changing the idle screw settings back and forth, resetting the TPS every time because the ECU needs to know where 0% throttle is, and you're moving it with that throttle screw. And we were chasing our tails, man. It was kind of a frustrating experience because it had idle surged on the first start, and I thought it was just that. And after spending a while tinkering with the settings, trying things, disconnecting the blow-off valve, nothing was working. And in traditional Florida fashion, you can see how quick it gets dark. It goes from overcast to literally looking like it's nighttime, and it was probably 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and that was our cue to exit stage left. We knew the thunderstorm was coming. So while we waited out the thunderstorm inside, I started digging into the ECU settings, and what I realized was, since I got this tuned from Matt Happel and there was a lot of leftover stuff from his twin-turbo Mustang, the idle settings were all set up for a car with drive-by-wire, which does not use an idle air control valve. So once I changed that, readjusted the throttle blade, we had it working mint. We're down at 10%, which is about where we want to be. You can see the fans are on. Air feels good for idle. Voltage is a little low. So after letting the car run for a while and doing a lot of tinkering on a lot of different things, like the alternator wasn't charging at first, we figured that out. There's always these little tiny things, especially with a PDM setup where there's all this programming involved. With that mostly done, the car running good, really the next step is to make it drive. So one thing we needed to do was re-drill our rear rotors. So we had converted this car to 5x114. Our rotors were 5x120. So we had to re-drill those to 5x114 so that they would fit on, which would allow us to put our brake calipers on, which would allow us to finish our brake lines out for the rear and move on to something else on the Make It Drive agenda. So luckily we got the holes drilled right. They fit right back on, no issues there. And then I wanted to move on to finishing up the power steering pump. So I had left it enough time for the potting epoxy to cure, and now we needed to drill and tap for our fittings. So factory, these have a line with an O-ring. It's kind of a factory hard line that you put on, and making that work to AN is difficult. So instead what you do is just drill and tap a 3/8 NPT hole, and then you thread in a 3/8 NPT to AN fitting, and you're ready to party. So I decided to take the whole thing down and just tear the whole pump apart so that I wasn't going to risk getting, aluminum shavings down in the pump and ruining it before it ever has a chance to work, because that is something we would probably chase our tail on, not knowing if I ruined it or it's just not going to work for our application. So there's certain things like that where it's not just, oh, I don't want to hurt this piece. It's, I don't want to deal with the troubleshooting later and wondering what if, did some metal shaving get caught in there, or is it just a defective pump, or is this pump just not going to work with this steering rack? There's all these questions. So it was a little tricky, but not too bad. It's basically a hydraulic pump attached to a big electric motor, so it wasn't too bad to take apart and put back together. So with that all reassembled, the fitting in, it was time to reinstall it and get our wiring and lines hooked up. So with our lines here, it's a little bit tricky. We originally have it routing up between the downpipe and the header, but that's really obviously not the most ideal spot. And as I'm reinstalling it and getting the wiring hooked up, I'm realizing that I might want to route it a little bit of a different direction. So another thing that we needed to route a different direction was our power steering reservoir lines. So the bracket I had made for it, I couldn't rotate it all the way because it had these 2 return fittings. So we only need 1 return on this car. So I went ahead and cut one off, cleaned it all up on the belt grinder, blew this thing out with air because our whole goal was not to get any aluminum shavings in the power steering pump. made a little block off plate and welded that thing on, so that way we could rotate this thing a little bit further and get better line routing that's further away from the header. As we go through this whole process, the whole goal with any of these lines is keeping them as far away from heat as possible. Even if you think you're in a safe place, sometimes the line can come loose and it can land on a header and it can be absolutely catastrophic. So that's one of the biggest things we've planned around this entire build. So Josue goes ahead and gets the lines in with some nice heat sleeving, and the power steering is about wrapped up. All right, well, power steering system is pretty much fully wrapped up. We still need to P-clamp these hoses. Josue did find in a box this Mishimoto heat sleeving, Velcro heat sleeving that I had, which worked out really, really well. Just to protect them for the little bit of time they do go near-ish to the downpipe. So we'll clamp them out of the way. We'll give that a trial run. If we're having any issues with it again, we'll change it back. But if this works out, they're better protected. You know, it's one of those things. So the only thing left to do is we've got to get a line for here. So this is just a rubber hose end. So we need to get a molded 90 to boom go up here, because this is obviously, of course, pointing in the worst possible direction it could be. But otherwise, the power steering's wrapped up. Get that line, put fluid in it, bleed it, see if it works. So really happy to have that knocked out. That was one of those, we don't need to do that right now projects. And then they sneak up on you. You're like, all right, are we ready to test? Oh wait, we still got to do the power steering. So I'm glad to have that done and out of the way. Overall, man, I feel like we made really good progress. Those lines should be here in a day or so to knock that out, and then we can bleed the brakes, bleed the clutch, and the biggest thing is bleed the clutch, because once we bleed the clutch, we can put it in gear for the first time. And if you know anything about dog boxes, they make this big clunk when you put them in gear. And I know it sounds silly, but it's one of those cool things that I've always wanted to experience, is having a dog box and putting it in gear. The clunk that shakes the whole car. That's probably going to be the most exciting moment of the build for me, when I finally get to put this thing in gear. I've been daydreaming about putting it in gear since I bought this transmission. So yeah, otherwise really happy with where we're at. I mean, to me, that test of like letting the car run up to operating temp is a much bigger moment than even the first start. You know, I've started cars that were not even halfway done, just with some wires, twist tied and hooking up to a battery with jumper cables. And, you can start a car and still have a long road to go. But getting to that point, doing the full systems check, making sure it's not going to leak oil, making sure the cooling system's adequate and the car's not going to just keep getting hot and, there's no leaks, that goes through and test, the electrical system, how I programmed everything, does everything come on when it should, do the fans shut off when they should, you really go through all that. So that moment when I can let the car run here and step away and know that it's going to do its thing, it's going to turn the fans on, it's got the water pump on, all that. For me, that is a really big moment, just second to the first drive, assuming it drives well, right? So anyway, I'm jibber jabbering. Yeah, so next episode, hopefully we'll be putting this thing in gear, which I promise you won't want to miss that. I can imagine my reaction is going to be great, because it's going to be a cool feeling. So otherwise, yeah, we're kind of out of time, waiting on a couple little things, but for now, I guess that's it. So thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I hope to see you next time. Goodbye. Side note, we brought the Miata in here. Interesting to see new versus old. The old girl's lived a hard life. She's put up with a lot of crap from us. Oh, it's crazy to see them both side by side in the same shop. Wow. Anyway.